I mean, look at how that frickin' tube came out. Welcome back to the Lost Cause Ranch. That is right, it is Range Rover Camper Day once again, and we are continuing on our little 1-ton axle swap to get this thing in proper shape. For those of you who have not been following along, this is our 1995 Range Rover Classic with a 1976 Toyota Sunraider camper shell on it. Because who doesn't need that? And we are in the process of doing a little bit of a restoration to bring this back to its former glory. And the biggest part of that little rehab is our 1-ton Chevy 8-lug axle swap. With the camper shell, this thing is much wider than a factory Range Rover. And you can see the mighty negative offset wheel that was installed to add some track width. Well, we're gonna add some track width with some wider axles along with some stronger axles, because sometimes the factory Land Rover axles act like they're made of glass. And the way we're going about this axle swap is to use the factory mounting locations for all the suspension links, including the radius arms, pan hard bar up front, and even the sway bar, because that's a little necessary with how tall the camper is. Last video, we got everything jigged up using our little storage cart and these very fancy little fixtures. And with the rear almost sorted out, it's time to see if the front is gonna work. The biggest thing I'm worried about is clearance issues. I mean, just look at the two compared to each other. That 14-bolt rear axle is wider than the factory Land Rover one, even without hubs or anything installed. And the pumpkin is quite a bit bigger, but we went ahead and shaved that down and made a diff cover to match. That way this big rear now has the same ground clearance as the factory one. But today's project, we need to figure out the front. Hopefully it'll fit. Now, to make this all happen, we need the front axle off the Risco Disco. It doesn't do us a whole lot of good sitting over here. Now, the only problem is I've been sitting outside for some time and the frickin' brakes are locked up. And in one of my wiser moves, I sold my skid steer. And as you all know, I'm a pretty strong guy, but I don't think even I can manhandle that thing around too far. I think we have a solution though. That's gonna harken back to our old Honda days. I don't know if any of you guys had a Civic or an Integra and you wanted to be a cool drifter. Lunch trays. These guys were the ticket to make that happen. Yes, that's right. We got a pair of lunch trays. I do think we need to get the shocks out of the way first, though. Them digging in kind of defeats the purpose of those. All right, we're in good shape. Well, let's go with we're in better shape now. For those of you who did not grow up having a front-wheel drive car while simultaneously wanting to be a star in the next Tokyo Drift, you'd use the lunch trays underneath your rear wheels so it would just slide uncontrollably, you know, nice and safe. Uncontrollable is pretty much what we're going for here. Now, in what is obviously one of my more well thought out and genius plans, what we're gonna do is strap the axle to the LR4 and essentially use those lunch trays as skates to try and drag it all the way over to the front of the shop without 100% destroying my yard. I'm sure it'll work out fine. As you can see, my trays worked exactly as planned, and they did a fine job of protecting those 2 square feet of grass. So now we've made it to here, I guess I can try and manhandle it the rest of the way so it's not blocking the driveway. Maybe these guys will work better on the asphalt. See, I know I busted them out for some reason. And now we just need to do some more rusty bolt removal. Quite possibly my favorite thing to do. But that seems like a better job to do tomorrow, where we have a bit more daylight. So it's the next day. Obviously some better daylight, but I'll let you in on a little secret. The real reason why I waited until tomorrow, which is today, to do this, was it is a freaking balmy 45 degrees out here in Iowa. It's gonna be short-lived though. It's gonna be below 0 in 2 days. Great. And I also found out we did a little sacrificial skidding on our lunch trays. I'm telling you, it was a flawless plan. Here's to hoping that the impact wrench can just get most of these out, because I'd much rather prefer to do that than to have to cut a bunch of stuff apart again. I'll be honest, pretty shocked. Well, this side's less fun. The impact doesn't fit because there's no room. It's still working out decent. A little easier swinging this way. All right, we're almost getting there. That hurt. Kind of hit my chin a little bit, bit my teeth onto my teeth. Smart. Finally. It wasn't exactly terrible. It wasn't fun, but I guess it could have been worse. We're gonna roll this up towards the door. We're gonna get that guy tucked inside so we can close the door, because it's gonna get cold again. And in some other unfortunate news, got another broken Land Rover. But in some fortunate news, kind of repair I like. Simple and cheap. So I had the old budget LR4 on the highway the other day. Had to pass someone, put it to the wood so we could hear the beautiful exhaust. But instead we released our James Bond smoke screen. It looked like I blew the frickin' thing up, much like this LR4 in a past video. And the fix on that guy was just the PCV diaphragms. So here in Iowa, lately we've had quite a few big temperature swings. And the day that I put the LR4 to the wood, we had pretty close to 0 degrees Fahrenheit weather. A lot of times old rubber does not like that. So I believe we have a Tor diaphragm. These are on top the right valve cover towards the rear, and they are part of the PCV system, which relieves crankcase pressure. And these little diaphragms are the separator from the oil to the intake. So one of these tears, you just start sucking oil straight into your intake, therefore sucking oil right into the engine, burning a ton of it. It's getting a little too dark to show you guys what I'm doing back here. So if you want to see the actual fix, I'll put a link to that video down below, but we will just pop these guys off. And here are the old ones. No huge tears, couple little cracks on them, but if you're ever experiencing an issue with your PCV, there is one quick and easy test to pinpoint which of the two valves is leaking. On both of the caps, there is this little hole right in the center. If you fire the LR4 up and tap your finger over it and hear a change from something like a vacuum leak, that's a sure pinpoint that you got a problem with one of these guys. The rear one on the LR4 had a vacuum leak. It was sucking air into the engine through this little hole. If you put your finger over it, it would stop. Now that we got the new ones on, it is good to go. We'll be able to pound on it once again. So the front axle we need is right there. I need to get it outside, and in typical Joe fashion, I have the place stuffed full. We always seem to have to do a little rearranging. I probably need less stuff. We got quite the conglomeration going on here. You know, a guy built a gantry crane so we didn't have to lift things like this, but then that same guy plugged the frickin' shop full of stuff. So we went ahead and busted Ted's tube sander back out to get that guy into a shape where we can weld some tabs onto it. This thing is just such a freaking awesome tool. I mean, look at how that freaking tube came out. And we don't even have all that much time invested into that. But both those tubes will be in good shape to weld some tabs onto it. The front and the rear axle will both get completely sandblasted, and we'll throw a proper paint job on them. But that'll be after everything is figured out and fully welded on. Well, since we moved the axles over to this largely more spacious area, we get to use the gantry crane to do some of the heavy lifting. Gotta love swollen nuts. Frickin' hate these things. Now, if you remember on the video that we did the rear axle, we made these plates with the jigs on it, bolt on. And being they're bolt on, we need to bolt them off. Now that we got those other jigs out of the way, we can get this axle somewhat into place. Now we're just going to use the hoist to pull the pinion up to roughly 90 degrees, just so we have a good reference point. All right, so we got this roughly sitting where it needs to be. This is a similar process to what we did on the rear to come up with these guys that allowed us to mount all these in the correct positions. On the rear, we centered up the axle on our little cart to make it a little bit easier for me math-wise. This front one isn't going to quite work out that way. We have to have it shifted to this side some, because with the offset pumpkin, everything gets quite a bit tighter up front here, and I want everything to land on a consistent part of the tube so it doesn't end up sitting all cattywampus in there. If we shifted it over and set it up here, the axle would not be sitting parallel to the cart. So next up is to go back and draw some more of our little fixture components so we can get those cut out. And once again, we have some very highly detailed notes, which leaves us with zero ability to make a mistake. So now we have the parts that we need to jig this thing out. Like always, the little $1,000 plasma feels like the best money spent every single time I use it, and it has been getting quite a bit of use around here and is definitely due for a cleanup. You see the water table is pretty low on the water part. I've been letting it evaporate out lately so we can scrape everything out of here and get everything washed back up. I may even finally treat it to a nice machine torch, something that is straight and a little more easy to manage with everything. This guy likes to drag and get caught every once in a while. I held off on purchasing that. I was thinking maybe we'd have to upgrade to a hypertherm. It's what I've always used in the past on our plasma tables, but this little guy, for my use, has done just fine so far. There's the drop of it cutting 1/2 inch plate. Can't beat that. So we just need to get a couple measurements on the axle itself. So those guys are just our little slugs to simulate our radius arm when we go to make the jig. Those will go right in, and we'll build a brace down to those plates we just cut out. That way, just like last time when we set the 8-lug axle under our little cart, we'll be able to build these brackets into the same exact location as they are on the factory Rover axle, making the 1-ton axle swap a fairly bolt-in affair. All right, so we need to bolt our fresh new plates into place. And on this side, we actually modified it a little bit, and you can see we have a longer tang. That's to meet up to everything going on over here. And then so we can line up the 1-ton diff at the correct angle, we're just gonna set our pinion flange to 90 degrees off the cart itself. And now we can start getting everything located And then for the panhard bar, we just need this right side one. We don't need to locate this left-hand side because like many parts Land Rover builds, the front axle is set up for left and right-hand drive. So this one is not used over here in the US. We use that one instead. If we go over to the Defender here, you can see the panhard bar comes off the steering gear mount set up over here and goes from the left side on the frame to the right side on the axle. If we were right-hand drive, we'd have all that over here, and it would do the exact opposite with the panhard bar coming from here down to that mount right there. As you can see, not used on a left-hand drive one, and since the Range Rover Camper is never going to be right-hand drive, we're not going to add some extra stuff that it doesn't need. And then we'll get our sway bar mount sitting, maybe. Need a different size bolt. Like I said, we'll get our sway bar mount sitting into place. All right, on this back side for the panhard mount, we're gonna have to get a little creative with what we got going on here. And we'll do something like so, I think. So we'll tack this guy on up here. Then we'll make sure to get this guy out of there before we move anything and fully weld this up. That way we don't knock it out of alignment. We may put another brace in it here, but I think it should do for what we're going for. All right, so that jig is fully welded up now. Like I said when we were building the rear one, if this was going to be for more than a single use, we'd build a much more substantial and nicer jig. But being we are just going to lift this guy off right now and set that guy right on there and get all our mounts tacked on right away, we can live with something much simpler like this guy here. Now what? I think we'll set him there for now. This thing sure does make life quite a bit easier than figuring out a way to manhandle these guys around. All right, we got the 8-lug front axle sitting in the cart, but we ran into yet another size problem. And right here is why I'm very happy that we are jigging this guy up outside of the Range Rover Camper and doing all of this ahead of time before we yank the factory axles out of that guy, because this may take some figuring. And it's much easier to figure it out in the open like this. So measuring everything out, these Sharpie marks right here are where the radius arm mounts need to be. The radius arm would be right inside that. So you say, Joe, that's easy. Just slide this down so it lines up with those guys. Well, herein lies the problem. We slide this side, that way anymore, we run into this nice chunk of cast iron. We need to shift about 1.5 inches to this side. For the radius arm to clear, that is going to require some removal of material. Not only do we have this chunk to contend with, which can mostly stay in place, we have this web on the bottom that needs to disappear because the radius arm would be hitting that. We could hack away at this with an angle grinder, but I'm not quite sure that's what I want to do just yet. So I'm going to think on that for a minute. In a perfect world, I'd like to swing the axle back there and rig up a way to get the pumpkin on the little mill so we can do a nice clean cut. But I'm not quite sure that's feasible, or at least feasible without a ton of frickin' work jockeying stuff around. So for the time being, we're going to continue on, take some measurements so we can get some tabs made up. And there is what we came up with. You'll notice we only have 3 of the brackets when we need 4, but I'll explain that in just a second. All right, so we got our side profiles of the brackets cut out. These will be what the front radius arms mount to, 1 on each side of each radius arm, which in theory should equal 4, but we only have 3. And those guys will sit something like that right on the axle. And then we have the problem side. This outer bracket will sit something like that, but it'll have to sit on that line, which means the inner one has to sit right there. And you guys can see the problem just like I can. Square peg, round hole. So whenever we decide what we're doing with this, we'll have to make the inner profile match this piece here. You can see just how much that sticks above what the other side will. It is doable though, and won't be a terrible problem once we decide which way to attack it. Here is that piece tacked together. Guess at least we got something that looks half decent out of today's project, and that guy should work out well on the front axle. We could have went what I would consider the easier route and just made our own 4-link setup front and rear on the camper, but driving that thing 2,000 plus miles across country when we picked it up, it went down the road at 70 miles an hour. Fantastic. It was nice and comfortable. It did well on the light off-roading that we did. So to tell you the truth, I really don't want to mess with that. It's quite a unique piece with the extra height, width, and weight of that camper shell on the back. So if the suspension's working, we're going to keep it that way. We're going to keep trucking on, making these massive, stronger, and wider axles fit underneath that thing. And the next video on these will bring you up to date on what we decided to do on this side, and we'll actually swing both this axle and this axle underneath this guy. I'm really excited to see how it all comes together, and excited to have 1-tons using factory radius arms underneath a Land Rover. Hope you guys are excited too. I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you subscribing, and we will catch you on the next one. I'm going to try and put one out next week, but it is currently -2 out. That's in Fahrenheit, so negative a lot in Celsius, and over the next couple days it's going to get down to -12 before the wind chill. So I don't know how motivated I'm going to be to go outside, but hopefully see you next week, because we have a Freelander to tear apart. And in some good news, like I said, it's -2, and our little mini split is still putting out heat. Can't beat that.